On the 17th of June, 1944, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel found himself standing directly across from Adolf Hitler in a concrete bunker located near Margiville, France. Nearly 2 weeks had elapsed since the Allies launched their invasion. Hour by hour, the circumstances in Normandy were growing increasingly dire. Rommel had arrived to deliver a stark warning that none of his fellow German generals had the courage to voice openly. The defensive lines were crumbling before their eyes. Allied aircraft were systematically obliterating anything that dared to move. The panzer divisions that Hitler had stubbornly kept in reserve were now arriving far too late, and they were being completely wiped out before they could even make it to the coastal areas. Rommel spoke to Hitler with brutal honesty, explaining that unless the German military was permitted to fall back to positions they could actually defend, the entire Western Front would crumble into nothing within a matter of weeks. Here was the Desert Fox, Germany's most celebrated and renowned commander of the entire war, essentially pleading for permission to retreat. The response Hitler would give him was destined to seal the fate of an entire army. Back in November of 1943, Hitler had dispatched Rommel on a mission to personally inspect the defensive fortifications along the Atlantic Wall. What Rommel discovered when he arrived left him utterly horrified. Despite all the years of propaganda boasting about an impregnable fortress Europe, the reality was that the actual fortifications were nowhere near complete. They were desperately short on manpower, and worst of all, they were concentrated in all the wrong locations. The Normandy beaches in particular had far fewer fortifications than the Pas-de-Calais region. The German strategic planners had made the assumption that the invasion force would naturally come across at the narrowest point of the English Channel. Rommel immediately set about changing this dangerous situation. He commanded his forces to lay millions of mines across the beach areas. He ordered the flooding of fields situated behind the coastline, creating deadly traps for any paratroopers who might land there. He had his men plant sharpened wooden stakes throughout every possible zone where gliders might attempt to land. These obstacles became known among his soldiers as, quote, zero. However, Rommel understood deep down that beach obstacles alone wouldn't be sufficient to repel the invasion. He desperately needed panzer tank divisions, and he needed them positioned right up close to the water's edge. Rommel's commanding officer was Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, a 68-year-old veteran who held command over all German forces stationed in the West. These two field marshals found themselves in complete disagreement about how their armored reserves should be deployed. Rundstedt's preference was to keep the panzer divisions held back inland, strategically positioned so they could launch counterattacks against whatever location the Allies ultimately chose for their landing. This approach represented traditional German military doctrine. Allow the enemy to commit their forces first, then annihilate them with concentrated armored power. But Rommel had learned entirely different lessons during his campaigns in North Africa. He had witnessed firsthand the devastating capabilities of Allied air superiority and what it could do to tank columns attempting to move during daylight hours. He understood with absolute certainty that any German armored units trying to reach the beaches after the invasion had already begun would be completely destroyed from the air long before they could arrive at their destination. The only realistic chance of stopping the invasion, Rommel insisted, was to position the panzer forces close to the beaches beforehand and crush the Allies during those critical first 24 hours. Once the Allied forces managed to establish themselves ashore in significant strength, it would be far too late to stop them. Hitler listened carefully to both arguments presented by his field marshals and then proceeded to make what was arguably the worst possible decision. Rather than decisively choosing one strategic approach over the other, Hitler attempted to split the difference between them. He granted Rommel direct control over 3 panzer divisions that were positioned relatively near the coastal areas. He left 3 additional divisions under Rundstedt's command, stationed further inland. But then Hitler retained personal control over 4 panzer divisions, keeping them as a strategic reserve force. These particular divisions could not be moved or deployed without Hitler's direct personal authorization. Not Rommel's authorization, not Rundstedt's. Only Hitler himself possessed the authority to release them into battle. This command arrangement virtually guaranteed they would experience the worst aspects of both strategic approaches. Rommel didn't have sufficient tank forces near the beaches to actually stop an invasion force. Rundstedt didn't have enough tanks positioned inland to launch any kind of decisive counterattack. And meanwhile, the strategic reserve forces were completely tied to a decision-making process that required waking up a man who kept extremely irregular hours and harbored deep distrust toward his own generals. Rommel voiced his protests against this arrangement repeatedly and emphatically. Every single one of his requests was flatly denied. Hitler remained convinced that he understood better than his experienced field marshals how France should be defended. The invasion was approaching rapidly, and the German command structure had essentially paralyzed itself before the first Allied soldier even set foot on a beach. On the 5th of June, 1944, Rommel departed from France and headed back to Germany. His wife, Lucy, was celebrating her 50th birthday the following day, and Rommel had made plans to visit Hitler afterward to make one final, desperate plea for control of the Panzer reserves. The weather conditions over the English Channel were absolutely terrible at that moment. German meteorologists were predicting that these conditions would persist for several more days. No rational military commander would launch an invasion under these circumstances, they reasoned. Their assessment turned out to be completely wrong. Allied weather forecasters had managed to spot a brief window of marginally acceptable weather conditions approaching. General Eisenhower made the monumentally important decision to proceed with the invasion. During the early morning hours of June 6th, Allied paratroopers began dropping from the sky behind the Normandy beach defenses. By the time dawn broke, the largest amphibious invasion in all of human history was fully underway. More than 156,000 Allied troops were simultaneously storming a 50-mile stretch of French coastline. Meanwhile, Rommel was back in Germany, celebrating his wife's birthday. Hitler was sound asleep at the Berghof, his mountain retreat. And the Panzer Reserve forces sat completely motionless, waiting for authorization that wouldn't arrive for many more hours. Only a single Panzer division managed to respond to the invasion on that first day of June 6th, the 21st Panzer Division, which Rommel had wisely positioned near Caen. They launched their counterattack during the afternoon hours and actually succeeded in reaching the beaches in the gap between the British landing zones, but they were fighting completely alone. No reinforcements were on their way to support them. The 21st Panzer Division faced an impossible choice: withdraw immediately or face total destruction. Hitler didn't wake up until nearly noon that day. His staff members had been genuinely afraid to disturb his sleep. When they finally worked up the courage to inform him about the invasion, Hitler dismissed the entire operation as merely a diversionary tactic. He remained obsessively fixated on the belief that the real invasion would come at the shorter northern crossing point. At 4 o'clock in the afternoon, a full 10 hours after the landings had begun, Hitler finally gave authorization to release 2 Panzer divisions. The 12th SS Panzer Division and Panzer Lehr began their preparations to move toward Normandy, but Allied aircraft had complete control of the skies above. The tanks couldn't risk moving until darkness fell. The roads leading to Normandy transformed into killing grounds of unimaginable destruction. Tanks burst into flames. Supply trucks exploded violently. Soldiers died trapped inside their vehicles before they ever laid eyes on an actual enemy soldier. Everything that Rommel had predicted with such certainty was now happening exactly as he had warned. Rommel rushed back to France on June 6th as quickly as he could. By the time he finally reached his headquarters at the Château de la Roche-Guyon, the tactical situation had already become critical. The Allied forces had successfully established firm beachheads on all 5 of their designated landing zones. The American forces at Omaha Beach had suffered absolutely horrific casualties, but through sheer determination, they had managed to fight their way off the beach and inland. British and Canadian forces were steadily pushing inland toward Caen. Rommel immediately threw every single unit he had available into desperate counterattacks. For an entire week, German forces tried with everything they had to push the Allies back into the sea. Every single attack was systematically broken apart by devastating Allied naval gunfire and relentless air strikes. The Desert Fox watched helplessly as his army was being methodically destroyed piece by piece right before his eyes. Panzer divisions that had once conquered France in a mere 6 weeks were now being ground down to nothing in just a matter of days. Reinforcements arrived at the front completely exhausted and severely depleted, their columns having been shattered by repeated air attacks during their journey to the battlefield. By mid-June, Rommel knew the terrible truth with absolute certainty. The battle for Normandy was already lost beyond any hope of recovery. Hey, where are you watching this video from? Drop a comment and let us know which country you're tuning in from. On June 17th, Hitler personally flew to France for what would be his only visit to the Western Front since the invasion had begun. He met with both Rommel and Rundstedt at a command bunker near Margivol, a bunker that had originally been constructed for a planned invasion of England that never materialized. The meeting opened with Hitler delivering a lengthy lecture to his field marshals about the absolute necessity of holding every single inch of ground. He spoke enthusiastically about miracle weapons that would supposedly turn the tide of the entire war. V-1 flying bombs were already striking targets in England at that very moment. V-2 rockets would follow soon after, he promised. The Allies would be forced to sue for peace once German technological superiority overwhelmed them completely. Rommel interrupted him abruptly. He hadn't traveled all this way to sit and listen to complete fantasy. He had come to tell Hitler what was actually, truly, happening on the ground in Normandy. German forces were suffering approximately 2,500 casualties every single day, Rommel reported with stark clarity. Replacement troops were arriving at only a small fraction of that rate. Allied air power maintained absolute, unchallenged control of the skies. Naval gunfire from Allied ships made any defensive position within 15 miles of the coast completely untenable and impossible to hold. The front would collapse entirely within weeks unless German forces received permission to conduct a withdrawal. Rommel laid out the situation in terms so clear and direct that Hitler could not possibly misunderstand them. The German forces in Normandy were being systematically annihilated. Without permission to conduct a fighting withdrawal to more defensible positions that they could actually hold, the entire Western Front would disintegrate into chaos. Hitler cut him off sharply before he could continue. There would be absolutely no withdrawal under any circumstances. Every position would be held to the last man standing. The invasion would be defeated through fanatical resistance, not through any form of retreat. Rommel tried once more to make him understand. He carefully explained that he wasn't requesting a retreat in the traditional sense. He was simply explaining the military reality of their situation. The choice they faced wasn't actually between holding their current positions and withdrawing to new ones. The real choice was between conducting a controlled, orderly withdrawal and experiencing a catastrophic, chaotic collapse. Hitler's response was absolutely brutal. Rommel was to concentrate solely on military operations and leave all strategic decisions to those who supposedly understood them better. The conversation was over, finished. As the meeting was breaking up, Rommel made one final comment that absolutely stunned everyone who was present. He told Hitler directly that he was glad the leadership had finally come to see the actual situation firsthand, and that all their troubles and difficulties stemmed from being commanded by men who directed military operations from desks positioned far away from the actual front lines. Hitler was so utterly shocked by this direct, brazen challenge to his authority that he couldn't immediately find the words to respond. 2 weeks later, Rundstedt reached exactly the same conclusion that Rommel had arrived at. The front was actively collapsing before their eyes. German forces near Caen were being absolutely pulverized by the massive guns of Allied naval vessels. He formally requested permission to pull his forces back out of effective range of these devastating guns. On July 1st, Hitler's headquarters denied the request outright. Rundstedt placed a call to Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel, who served as the chief of the Wehrmacht High Command in Berlin. He demanded to speak directly with Hitler himself. Keitel refused to connect him. He asked Rundstedt what exactly he was supposed to tell the Führer about the deteriorating situation. Rundstedt's response became absolutely legendary in military history. He told Keitel to make peace with the Allies, because there was literally nothing else Germany could possibly do at this point. Some historical accounts add that he called them fools as well. Within just a few days, Rundstedt was gone from his command. The exhausted 68-year-old field marshal had formally requested to be relieved of his duties, and Hitler cleverly used this request as a face-saving method to effectively fire him. He sent Rundstedt the Knight's Cross with oak leaves, along with a polite letter thanking him for his many years of loyal service. Field Marshal Günther von Kluge was appointed as his replacement. One field marshal had been successfully silenced. Rommel was about to meet exactly the same fate. Kluge arrived in France on July 3rd, carrying Hitler's complete and total confidence. He had been given explicit orders to enforce strict discipline and maintain an aggressive defensive posture. He had been thoroughly briefed that both Rommel and Rundstedt were defeatists, and that their pessimistic reports from the front were greatly exaggerated and unreliable. His first meeting with Rommel was openly confrontational in tone. Kluge warned Rommel sternly that he had better get accustomed to obeying orders without question. The tone of his warning strongly suggested that Kluge believed the previous field marshals had simply been making excuses for their own failures. That arrogant attitude lasted for approximately 48 hours. Once Kluge actually saw the real situation with his own eyes, the burning tanks scattered everywhere, the constant and relentless air attacks, the completely exhausted soldiers desperately holding impossible positions, he became just as alarmed as Rommel had been. Within just a few days of his arrival, Klug was sending the exact same desperate messages to Hitler that had gotten Rundstedt fired from his command. By mid-July, 3 different field marshals had now told Hitler directly that Normandy was lost beyond any hope. All 3 of them had been either ignored completely or dismissed from their positions. Hitler remained absolutely convinced that sheer willpower and determination could somehow overcome material and tactical superiority. On July 15, 1944, Rommel sent a formal written memorandum directly to Hitler. It represented his final, desperate attempt to make the leadership understand what was actually happening on the battlefield. The memo was completely unflinching and brutally honest. Rommel reported that German forces had suffered a staggering 97,000 casualties since D-Day, and this number included 2,360 officers. Replacement troops totaled only 6,000 men in comparison. At this catastrophic rate of attrition, the front would completely collapse within just 3 weeks' time. Rommel meticulously listed the equipment losses they had sustained. A total of 225 tanks had been destroyed. 17 of the Army's divisions had been rendered completely combat ineffective. The Luftwaffe had been utterly swept from the skies, unable to provide any meaningful air support. The memorandum concluded with an extremely direct warning. Rommel wrote that this unequal struggle was rapidly drawing to its inevitable close. He urgently urged Hitler to draw the proper political conclusions from the military situation they now faced. It was as close as Rommel could possibly come to directly telling Hitler that he needed to seek peace negotiations with the Allies. The Desert Fox was giving his leader one final opportunity to save what still remained of the German army. 2 days later, before Hitler could formulate any kind of response, a British fighter plane would change absolutely everything. July 17, 1944. Rommel was traveling back from a visit to the 1st SS Panzer Corps headquarters, located near the front lines. His staff car was driving along an exposed stretch of road when Allied fighter aircraft suddenly appeared overhead. The aircraft, either British Spitfires or Typhoons, accounts vary, opened fire and strafed Rommel's vehicle with machine gun fire. The driver was hit by the gunfire and lost control of the vehicle. The car crashed violently and flipped over. Rommel was thrown forcefully from the car during the crash. He suffered 3 separate skull fractures along with severe facial injuries. He was unconscious and bleeding profusely when his staff members finally found him. The Desert Fox was quickly evacuated to a field hospital, then transported to Paris, and finally sent all the way back to Germany to recover from his injuries. He would never return to active military command again. 3 days after Rommel's injury, on July 20th, a group of German military officers attempted to assassinate Hitler using a bomb at his headquarters in East Prussia. Hitler survived the assassination attempt. The conspirators were systematically hunted down and executed without mercy. Rommel had known some of the plotters personally. He had discussed the hopeless military situation with several of them in private conversations. Most historians believe that Rommel actually favored the idea of arresting Hitler to stand trial for his crimes, rather than outright assassination. But his name had been mentioned in connection with the conspiracy during the investigation. With Rommel hospitalized and recovering, and Rundstedt already dismissed from command, Hitler felt completely free to direct military operations himself. The result was absolutely catastrophic. In early August, Hitler personally ordered Operation Lüttich, a counterattack at Mortain that was specifically designed to cut off Patton's Third Army which had successfully broken through German defensive lines and was racing rapidly across France. Klug told Hitler bluntly that the attack was completely impossible to execute. German forces were far too weak. The Allies maintained total control of the skies above. Any concentration of armored forces would be spotted and destroyed from the air before it could even reach its objective. Hitler ordered the attack to proceed anyway, ignoring all professional military advice. 4 panzer divisions struck hard at the American lines on August 7th. They managed to push several miles into American positions before Allied aircraft located them. The slaughter that followed was absolutely total and complete. P-47 Thunderbolts and RAF Typhoons destroyed hundreds upon hundreds of German vehicles in a single day of devastating air attacks. The panzer divisions that Hitler had hoarded so carefully and kept in reserve were now nothing but burning wrecks scattered across the Norman countryside. Even worse than the massive losses was the tactical position Hitler's attack had created. His counterattack had driven German forces even deeper into a pocket that was rapidly closing around them on all sides. While Hitler's counterattack was failing miserably at Mortain, Allied forces were simultaneously swinging around both German flanks in a massive pincer movement. Patton's Third Army raced southward and then pivoted eastward. British and Canadian forces pushed steadily south from Caen toward Falaise. The jaws of a massive trap were closing shut around them. More than 100,000 German soldiers, representing the remnants of both the 7th Army and the 5th Panzer Army, were being methodically encircled in what would become known historically as the Falaise Pocket. Klug could see clearly what was happening and where this was leading. He desperately begged Hitler for permission to withdraw his forces before the trap closed completely around them. Every single hour of delay meant thousands more soldiers would be trapped inside an ever-shrinking pocket of death. Hitler refused to grant permission. There would be absolutely no withdrawal under any circumstances. German forces would hold their current positions and wait for reinforcements that simply did not exist and were never coming. By August 17th, the pocket had shrunk dramatically to a corridor measuring just a few miles wide. German soldiers were abandoning their vehicles entirely and attempting to escape on foot through the narrow gap. Allied artillery and aircraft methodically turned the pocket into an absolute killing ground. The Falaise Pocket finally closed completely on August 21st, 1944. What Allied soldiers discovered inside when they entered shocked even the most hardened combat veterans. General Eisenhower personally visited the battlefield 2 days after it was secured. He later wrote in his memoirs that it was actually possible to walk for hundreds of yards while stepping on nothing but dead and decaying human flesh. He called it one of the greatest killing fields of the entire war. The German losses inside that pocket were absolutely catastrophic and staggering. Between 10,000 and 15,000 soldiers were killed inside the pocket itself. Another 40,000 to 50,000 were taken prisoner by Allied forces. The roads throughout the area were completely choked with burned-out tanks, destroyed artillery pieces, and thousands upon thousands of dead horses. Some German soldiers did manage to escape before the gap closed completely. Perhaps somewhere between 20,000 and 50,000 men successfully fled eastward toward the Seine River. But they were forced to abandon virtually all of their heavy equipment and weapons. The German army in the West had effectively ceased to exist as any kind of organized fighting force. The collapse that Rommel had predicted during that meeting at Margiville had happened exactly as he had warned it would. It took 7 weeks instead of his estimated 3, but the final result was precisely the same. Paris was liberated by Allied forces on August 25, 1944, just 4 days after the Falaise pocket had finally closed. By September, Allied forces had advanced all the way to the German border itself. The war that Hitler continued to insist could still be won was now clearly and obviously lost. Field Marshal Kluge never made it back to Germany alive. On August 19th, as the pocket was in the process of collapsing around his forces, he took his own life rather than face what awaited him back home. His name had surfaced during the investigation of the July 20th assassination plot. Rommel was still recovering from his serious injuries when 2 generals arrived at his home on October 14th, 1944. They carried a direct message from Hitler himself. Rommel's name had surfaced during the ongoing investigation of the assassination plot against Hitler. He was formally accused of knowing about the conspiracy beforehand and failing to report it to the authorities. Hitler offered him a stark choice. He could face a trial before a Nazi people's court with terrible consequences for his entire family, or he could take poison and receive a state funeral with full honors as a war hero. Rommel walked into his son Manfred's room and told him quietly that in 15 minutes he would be dead. Then he climbed into a staff car with the 2 generals who had delivered Hitler's ultimatum. The Desert Fox died on a quiet, unremarkable road outside his own home. A cyanide capsule ended his life, saving his family from the horrors of the People's Court. The Nazi propaganda machine quickly announced to the public that he had succumbed to the injuries he had sustained from the strafing attack. Normandy wasn't the first time Hitler had overruled his experienced generals and caused an absolute catastrophe. It certainly wasn't the last time either. At Stalingrad, back in 1942, Hitler had refused to allow the Sixth Army to conduct a tactical retreat. Approximately 300,000 German soldiers were completely encircled by Soviet forces. Around 91,000 eventually surrendered. Fewer than 6,000 of them ever returned home alive. At Kursk, in 1943, Hitler ordered a massive offensive that his generals had explicitly warned was completely impossible to succeed. The German army lost more than 200,000 men in that battle and never recovered the strategic initiative on the Eastern Front. In Normandy, Hitler simply followed the exact same destructive pattern. He refused to listen to professional military advice. He insisted that willpower and determination could somehow overcome clear material superiority. He ordered his soldiers to hold tactically impossible positions until they were completely destroyed. Erwin Rommel was buried with full military honors on October 18, 1944. Thousands of people attended his elaborate funeral ceremony. The Nazi regime publicly praised him as a national hero who had died from wounds he had suffered in loyal service to Germany. The actual truth about his death remained carefully hidden from the public until after the war had ended. Only after Germany was finally defeated did Rommel's son, Manfred, reveal to the world that his father had actually been murdered by the very regime he had served for so many years. Rommel was not a hero in any simple or straightforward sense of that word. He had served Hitler loyally for many years of the war. He had commanded armies that successfully conquered nation after nation across Europe. He was deeply complicit in a regime that committed unprecedented crimes against humanity. But during that fateful summer of 1944, Rommel saw with crystal clarity what Hitler absolutely could not or would not see. The war was irreversibly lost. Continued fighting would only multiply the suffering of millions without changing the ultimate outcome in any way. He tried desperately to tell his leader this fundamental truth, and he paid for speaking that truth with his own life. The order that Hitler refused to give, the order to conduct a strategic withdrawal, was never issued to the German forces, and the army that Rommel had tried so hard to save was methodically destroyed in the fields and hedgerows of Normandy, exactly as he had warned it would be. So what do you think? Do you agree with Rommel's assessment that the war was already lost by that summer? Drop your thoughts in the comments below.